Welcome to the 7th lecture for English 421Y, and the first for Unit 3. In this video, I will introduce the concept of usability, briefly describe the assignment for this unit, overview a few key resources that we will be using over the next few weeks. Usability, according to Graves and Graves Chapter 9, refers to the actual conditions under which a document is used by real people to accomplish a task. When we say that a website or set of instructions are usable, what we're really saying is that they served a particular purpose for us as an individual user in a specific situation. To put it in another way, the same instructions can be perfectly usable to me and yet entirely unusable to someone else, whose purpose, context, or background knowledge is different than mine. Usability testing, then, determines the quality of the instructions as measured by how they helped or hindered the intended user. Usability is important to technical writing because it provides valuable data that can help writers iteratively revise their work over time. When a company conducts usability testing, they're not trying to prove that their document or website is useful. This would be a focus group, which is more about marketing a product to consumers. Rather, they're trying to see how real users actually interact with, respond to, and feel about whatever is being tested. Because all users have different notions of what is usable, most usability testing is conducted with multiple users so that the sample size is sufficiently large enough to allow for generalizable data. In other words, if you test with 100 people, you can have more confidence in the results than if you test with 2 people. If you have more confidence in those results, then they can be generalizable to other situations with more accuracy and more confidence. The goal of usability testing, then, is to identify errors, mistakes, and bugs, potential sources of confusion, frustration, or communication, features of the document that are either unexplained or underutilized, and any other evidence that will help the writer or designer develop a more user-centered document. During Unit 3, you will conduct usability research on one of the instructional documents you developed for Unit 2, either the visual instructions or the textual instructions, using 3 actual users from the scenario that you developed for that document. The goal of this project is to collect data and use it to make recommendations for how the document could be revised, expanded, or changed so that it is more effective for the intended user. That is to say, you won't actually be making further changes or revisions to the document. You will be developing a report that suggests and provides evidence for the changes that you think should be made before your document is used with actual audiences. Your audience for this project, that is, the audience for your report, should be an authority figure, for example, a supervisor, professor, or manager, within your scenario who would need to give you permission before you actually give your document to real users. Someone who needs to see evidence and documentation that you have tested your instructions with real users before just sending them out to actual clients or whoever. As part of this project, you will need to recruit 3 real participants with whom you will conduct formal research sessions, either in person or online via video conferencing, such as Google Hangouts, WebEx, or Skype. These users can be people you already know, such as coworkers, classmates, or friends, or they can be strangers that will need to be recruited to participate in the study. At the beginning of the unit, you will develop a research plan, or I think I call it a testing plan, that explains how you will recruit participants, describes the research methods, tools, and resources you will need to complete your research, identifies the type of research you will be conducting, and explains the logistical details of your research sessions. That is, where you will test, when you will test, for how long you will test, etc. You will then be responsible for recruiting participants in person or by email, arranging to complete the research sessions in person or online, and then writing a short, formal recommendation report. While usability is more commonly associated with design fields, the concept is incredibly important to technical communicators who develop documentation for technology, including software, hardware, websites, etc. One of the reasons that I really like this chapter by Graves and Graves is that it's a usability approach to writing documentation. Most of the usability books or resources that you will find are on websites and software. For instance, the Krug chapters that I'm having you read this unit are specifically about websites. This one is about documentation, which I think makes it particularly useful for our purpose. So in addition to software and hardware, user documentation is also produced for a range of non-technical products and services, including prefabricated furniture, appliances, health insurance, children's toys, vehicles, and many, many more. As Graves and Graves note, bad documentation can cost a company big money. So testing is one way that technical communicators and their employers can ensure that their documentation will do the job it is supposed to do, creating satisfied customers and guaranteeing further sales. Whether those sales are for computers, Legos, IKEA furniture, or health insurance, the goal is always the same: improve the documentation to improve the user experience. We will be basing our concept of usability on the definition provided by Graves and Graves on page 249. They write that bad documentation they note that usability testing observes users working through a draft and then interviews them about their experiences and perceptions at the end of the test. Usability testing, then, is either A, conducted in multiple phases with further revision to the document completed in between, or B, completed all at once and integrated into a report. Each strategy has advantages and disadvantages. If you do multiple versions of a document and reiterate that document every single time, you're incorporating the feedback from earlier tests into subsequent tests. That tends to be longer, it takes more time, it often costs more money, or at least is more resource intensive because it's multiple tests. If you complete testing all at once, it's harder to go back and change things. There are multiple examples of this, but if you complete testing at the end of the development process, it's harder to, say, completely redevelop whatever it is that you're creating. If I asked you to, create a 20-page manual and then we tested it and found out, well, actually, this is the wrong topic completely, it's not useful at all, that's a ton of time that is lost. If instead I asked you to create a 2-page manual and then we revised it and added a page, and then we revised it again and added another page, and we revised it again and added another page, that is much easier for me to say, well, I didn't like what you did the first time, but let's change it as we go. So what are you changing in documentation when you do usability testing? Graves and Graves identify 5 basic things that can be targeted for in a usability test. Those 5 things that you can test for are organization, or how information is presented in the document, including the use of sections, grid structure, transitions, and design features such as alignment or proximity. Second is accessibility, or how effectively the document helps users navigate content and find the information they need, including tables of contents, menus, page numbers, headers, graphics, etc. Third is clarity and readability, or how effectively the text is able to communicate to the reader any complex details, procedural steps, warnings or cautions, etc. And then completeness, or how successful the document is at presenting all of the information the user would need in order to use the documentation for its intended purpose. And then finally, the appropriateness of visuals, or how well the visual content of the document matches the textual content and how relevant all visuals are to the purpose of the user. These 5 things all appear in usability testing in different ways. And you need to be prepared to not just ask questions like, how do you feel about the organization, but to observe the user struggling to find the information that they need. Or asking someone, how complete do you feel that this prose is? That won't get you anywhere. But asking them, is there anything that you feel is left out? Or what questions do you have? Or if you were using this as intended, what do you think you might not understand? In other words, you're not asking the questions to get at what you want to know. How appropriate are the visual aids? But rather, you are asking questions and giving prompts that will allow you to see evidence of how appropriate the visual aids actually are. That is a tricky distinction and something that I think comes through when you first do a test. And that needs to be changed in subsequent tests. It's important to note that the goal of usability research is to test and improve the document, not test the knowledge or correct the behavior of the user. In the PowerPoint presentation, I walk through that basic concept. This first visual kind of effectively illustrates what I mean by that. There's usually a gap between what users do without thinking, that's the user experience on the right, the bike trail that leads to the right and through the grass, and what designers expected that users would do. That is this path that veers off to the left and then meets up with another path over here. The goal of usability testing is not to say to the user, what you're doing is wrong, stay off the grass, but rather, as the designer, to realize, well, why are people using this path on the right? Why did they create a new path? Why does the path on the left, why is it not sufficient for their needs and purposes? What can we do to change the path structure in order to accommodate the needs and interests of the user? So this presentation walks through your goal as a facilitator of a usability test or a research session, which is not to erase that gap in knowledge between what the user does and what the designer expects, but rather to observe that gap as best as you can in order to help the design make changes that are user-centered. As the comic near the beginning of the PowerPoint presentation illustrates, it can be difficult to see a user fail to correctly use what you see as a perfect product. You understand how it should be used. Why don't they understand? No, that's not how you're supposed to do it. You're doing it wrong. Rather than getting frustrated or angry and actually shouting at a participant, which is a terrible idea, think of this frustration that you are having between seeing what they should be doing, what you think they should be doing, and what they're actually doing, as an opportunity to see how the user would behave if you weren't there. You're not going to be there to say, no, you're doing it wrong if they're in their home, or at least that would be super creepy if you were. Because testing is inherently iterative, that is, you test multiple versions of an object over time and conduct revisions in between, each new revision offers another opportunity to see how the changes you've made impact user behavior. To put it another way, a participant cannot fail the test. If the test does not go well, that is a failure of the document. More importantly, it is an opportunity for you as the writer and designer to learn what went wrong and how you might be able to fix it for future users. If a session just does not go well, that tells you, okay, well, either I need to change how I'm testing, or the document just doesn't work. Usability research can often be a more useful term than usability testing, as it emphasizes observation, data collection, and qualitative research methods. Typically, user research is a broader process that includes testing. So testing is a form of usability research, but not all usability research is testing. That is something that I'll explain in more detail in the next lecture. Unlike focus groups or market testing, user research is about understanding how users think and act in certain situations. It is naturalistic because it is trying to see what participants would do in an actual natural environment. As a researcher, your goal is to facilitate the process of testing or research without being too involved, since you cannot possibly be with each and every future user. In other words, you're trying to facilitate a natural environment. You're not trying to supply them the answer or correct their behavior or say, well, why do you like this? You're not asking loaded questions. You're prompting them to simply behave, and then you're observing and recording that behavior. Your responsibility as a facilitator then is to first set up the test and explain how things will work. Second, keep the user focused and on task. Third, encourage them to think out loud and occasionally prompt them to respond to something. For example, what did you expect to happen when you... Fourth, make sure they're not getting angry, frustrated, or anxious. If that happens, you need to stop the test immediately. You're also making sure that they don't get hurt. I had a student last semester who was having his participants do something with soldering, and his participant burned themselves. Don't do that. If they don't know how to do it safely, then don't have them do it, or make sure that they understand how to do it safely. Don't hurt your participants. And then finally, ask questions, which can be done after the testing session is finished or during the testing session if you aren't actually doing testing. So if you're doing testing, then you might have an interview component afterwards. If you're not doing testing, then you might just give them the document, ask them to take a look at it, read it, ask them to think out loud as they are reading it, and then ask them questions while they're reading it. To illustrate this example and the role of the facilitator, I've asked you in Activity 7 to watch a short video. This video illustrates what a typical usability test would look like. Only in this case, the participant is a little girl, and the object being tested is a paper mock-up of a website. Beyond being completely adorable, this video shows a pretty great and pretty realistic use of testing procedures. As you watch, pay attention to the kinds of prompts and questions the facilitators use. Notice that the questions are usually open-ended, while the prompts are very specific and direct. The captions on the video are also extremely useful, as they point out key moments in the session and call your attention to important things, such as here, ask questions that qualify the participant, or demographic questions that explain why you've selected this particular participant. At the end of the video, which I'll skip ahead a little bit, they say always end with a question asking if there's anything else that the user wants to talk about. These kinds of prompts show and illustrate how to actually do testing with a real audience. This video is simple, but it effectively shows the structure of a session. And if you've never done usability testing before, any kind of qualitative observational research, this gives you a pretty good idea of where to start. Finally, the biggest piece of advice that I have for this project is to treat the first of your 3 research sessions or testing sessions as a pilot session. In qualitative research, a pilot study is a practice research session meant to help you refine your research protocol, revise your interview questions, and adjust your methods and equipment. For our purposes, I suggest treating your first research session as a pilot and making adjustments afterwards to fix any problems. For example, last semester I had a student who interviewed his housemate and found that he was way too informal and conversational, which made the data he got less useful. His participant was a little bit too relaxed, they kind of joked around, they didn't take it seriously, the conversation that they had ended up veering completely off topic. He treated his first session as a pilot, which allowed him to make adjustments after the first interview, and he was able to change his interviewing style so that the subsequent interviews over the next 2 research sessions were a lot better. In other words, if one of your sessions bombs spectacularly, or is boring, or is way too short, figure out why and adjust for that in the next session. Then write about that in your report. Don't pretend it didn't happen. Don't go, oh, everything went well. Say, yeah, the first session was terrible. I changed this thing and that thing and these things, and the next sessions went much better and gave me much more usable data. That's it for today. Good luck as you begin developing your testing plan.